Good day. My name is Michael Fisher, the Fox for short, if you're interested in that name. That captures a little bit of my spirit, like the fox in the hen house. This is like the educator educationist in the educational schoolhouse. What's our role then? Yeah. So I'm interested, like John C. Coleman, who just did a video and I'm responding to it, in the idea of alternative education. And you could even use terms like emancipatory education, liberation education. Those are all possibilities. But in that realm, the most common word, emancipatory, is the one I like to use. But most people will use alternative education. I want to respond to his video on the Agora news site, a hub that the Apocatastasis Institute of Humanities, where John started that movement, that school, that alternative program. And I am now a member. I am also running the center, the Fearology Institute there. And the idea that really triggered me as I listened to John's latest talk on education, and he cited a couple of educators, and I want to review my response to those two educators he recited and why it relates to my own philosophical and long, long history in education, now some almost 50 years. So let me start with I watched a video the other day. This is before I watched the one that John just gave. I'll put a link below for that talk that John gives on the Institute. And this talk was called Education During Turbulent Times. That's starting to not become an uncommon phrase for a theme that educators, I'll just use in the widest sense of the word, those in the public system, those in the alternative systems of education, public and private, that troubled times or turbulent times is not an uncommon notion. It's starting to, of course, be very troubling. What do we do as educators in these times, and what is important is education in these times? So that's the context that I'm using. Let me just start with a few things that I picked up from the main three speakers on the panel for this particular conference, quite a high-level conference. I won't go into the details of all that. But just to give you a sense of the flavor, that basically I remember one of the speakers saying, and they were a Black African educator, long time career, now a dean of a college and so on, and they just said, we ought to be always looking at education as a practice of freedom, end of quote. Now that starts to set a tone for the kind of radicality, if you will, the kind of new creativeness that is still required, even though some alternative educations of various kinds will use that education as freedom. It's very rarely, as John speaks about in his video and his talk, and I tend to agree with him for the most part. I don't agree with John on everything about education, and that's not the point. We have our differences. At the Apocatastasis Institute, everyone is not a carbon copy of everybody else's philosophy. But the idea that practice of freedom really sets the tone, doesn't it? Now the question is how do we understand freedom? And John goes into a great detail about freedom. I'll get to that in a minute because he's looking at the individual and the collective, and I'm going to add my component to that particular philosophy of perspectives on freedom, if you will, on the emancipation, on the really the healthiness, to use simple language, of what it would be to be a humane and humanitarian society and world. But the other educator that came to the top and spoke was a teacher, also now a dean at a college, but has been a teacher for some 20 years, apparently still teaches part-time, grade 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 levels. So very much hands-on in the system. Now this person, I just want to quote her, really important. She says, working in the classroom today, I really think that our students feel like they are facing an existential crisis right now on multiple fronts, end of quote. I repeat that not for exaggeration, hype, and to make a moral panic that there's an existential crisis. I do not, because I practice the fearlessness ethic My goal is never to do fear mongering as much as I can so avoid. However, moral panics, fear mongering are very, very common, and in our educational systems, they've also infiltrated. And one could read that comment, there's an existential crisis for our students, as a kind of moral panic, and what should we do? What should we do? Well, that's not the kind of rushing in I'm doing, nor John Coleman at the Apocatastasis Institute and this alternative college in the humanities. We are in our patience, we are in our quiet, in our centeredness. Doesn't mean we're not passionate and wild at times too, but that is not the point of how to produce education toward freedom, if you will, and I use that language. So I'm still saying what I have heard from educators, I've heard in the world in the last 2 years, particularly, but it started with really when climate crisis, the global warming pandemic, as well as COVID, then these things started to hit society, particularly in the last 3, 4, 5 years. There is no doubt I've never heard the word existential crisis so often by so many people of different stripes. The progressive educators, of course, probably the most. Existential crisis, existential crisis, existential crisis. The sky is falling, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. Okay, I think those are the two main things that I wanted to bring up. Oh, there's one more from that conference of, again, one of the Black educators, women educators there. And she was quite a radical, very much anti-racism educator. But she said, what we're seeing now, in a somber voice, she speaks, is a celebration of anti-intellectualism in our society. Again, that educator would be very much in line, at least in part, with the work we do at the Apocatastasis Institute and our understanding of what is happening historically, which is John Coleman's, expertise as a historian. And I really appreciate working with a historian for the first time, my alignment in the alternative education movement with a historian. But before I get to John's video and do my response, I just want to say briefly a little bit about my background when I went into education. Was like after probably two careers, then my third career was education. Got my bachelor ed and became a primary school teacher, even though I was trained in secondary science education. I had a class in 5, 6 in a very fundamentalist religious community, and that was a real awakening for me because I'm not particularly a religious person in that sense, but I am a spiritual person and I have a sensibility to the importance of religion as well. This community where I taught, I was a very top-notch teacher. I got accolades from everyone, runner-up for the world, the best teacher in the rural district of that school system. And then I retired after 2 years because I realized I can't stand schools. I love teaching, and I probably will go nuts or drive the kids nuts because I'm going to rebel and rebel and rebel and rebel. And I was starting to get those children rebelling, and in a Christian, nice fundamentalist community in rural district, that's not particularly favorable to the community there. So again, we were in the public system at that time as a public school. But at the very same time that I'd gotten my degree and I was finishing in 1979, 80, and went off to that first job in this rural school, I was already reading people like Ivan Illich, John Holt, Paula Freire, and many other alternative radical educators who challenge and critique the educational systems and what is going to be called later on in John Coleman's talk a murder by the machine. The murder machine of education and colonialism, the colonizing of the human mind. One doesn't have to even be ethnocentric particularly to understand colonization. I'll leave that point out for another talk. So, oppression is the other word if you don't want to use colonization. Oppression of our minds, a numbing of our soul, if not a murder of our soul. So as an educator, you can see I have a passion right at the beginning of starting education because I was a little older. I was in my early 30s when I started to teach. I'm not in my 20s anymore. Been around the world. I've been a critic, came out of the ecological environmental movement. I was an activist. So I already had very much a skepticism toward the norms of society and the status quo. However, when I got into that job teaching, I was doing kind of a side work. And my side work was to start a journal, and it was called Janus Journal, an alternative education forum. I had started also a consulting company with my wife at that time, and it was also called Janus Alternatives. And you can look up Janus, the Greek god of two directions, looking to the past and the future at the same time, attempting to understand where we go here in the present and where we've come. What are the possibilities and how to get unhooked from the enslavement that happens within these large, broad educational systems that Ivan Illich and others have talked about. A kind of immaturizing, right? An infantilization that happens to the human being. So I was into that in the late 70s into the 1980s. And when I got mixed up with the public school system and they heard about, this ends the story, of my schooling career, they heard that I was putting on the first alternative education conference in the province that I was in. And my school district superintendent, heard me on the radio of the province there speaking about, I'm doing this conference, everybody's invited, public school or alternative school. I said, everybody's welcome. We ought to mix the public and the alternative together. Let's feed each other and the creativity that comes from both. So that was my agenda with my partner at the time, Janus Alternatives, sponsoring that conference. And we had a few people come, small handful. Had a couple, one or two guest speakers, but I also spoke. And it was a wonderful day. However, the next day I got a phone call when I was in school on Monday morning, and the superintendent, called me up and said, "You have a conflict of interest. You should not be having anything to do with the private and or alternative school movement while you're a public school employee." And I was on the phone, like, this is like, my class is ready to come in. The children are waiting for me. And I'm getting this phone call. It was so inappropriate. No letter, to give you a chance to respond, to warn you that, oh, they have a problem with, okay, so you have a problem with it. We'll talk about it. But oh no, it's like this phone call, 10 minutes before your class starts. Well, that just was enough to put me off on so many levels of resentment, including just basically resistance. And I said, well, I completely disagree that this is a conflict of interest. And I hung up the phone. I knew that was in my end of my, I was in my halfway through my second year, and I knew that I'll probably have to retire. Me and that superintendent are not going to get along, and I'll probably have to pay the price if I stay inside the school system. So I chose to retire at the end of that year. That story aside, let me go to John Coleman. John Coleman, as I said, has this great historical background, and he understands education in a very interesting way, but particularly in his talk, he really got me in touch with his Irish background, his ancestors, and his really valuing of educational critic. Particularly, he uses Ivan Illich, South American, Latin American, and then he uses Peirce, P.H. Peirce. And Peirce, as he talks about in the video, I had not heard of nor read, but I had heard, and John introduced me to this idea of the article, or I think it's a book, The Murder Machine, written in 1916 by Peirce. And I didn't know, this is why the video is so interesting to me, caught my attention, is that the Irish Republic, the IR, and I don't know how it's related to the IRA, but it's obviously IRA is a spin-off of that. And John says that before Peirce became this insurgent, rebellious, right, insurgent for the Irish Republic, and the obviously the organizations that followed from that, not necessarily they are all of his ilk, but they were of the ilk to resist the British colonization. And what one of my research showed that there's an 1100-year war between the British Isles or the United Kingdom, whatever you want to call it, the British and the Irish on their little island off the side. And it was always basically a struggle to resist the colonization of the British mind, the British education system, which did eventually invade and invade and invade. And that is a whole other story. But here's why it's so important to me. I had not realized that P.H. Pierce was part of the IRA movement of this Republican resistance to the British. But when I wrote my dissertation, which I shall move here, so my dissertation is in education, philosophy of education and curriculum. And I did that dissertation. I'll just show you the title. Fearless Leadership in and Out of the Fear Matrix. A huge work, to say the least. My dissertation from 2003, a PhD in education and philosophy. I did my main characters. So I wrote a screenplay, a major screenplay here. But then there's a whole bunch of preliminary documentation, argumentation, dialogue before I get to the screenplay. Screenplay, which happens to be my idea of a second play off the Matrix movie by the Wachowski brothers at that time. Back in their first film, 1999, I just went, whoa, that explains so much of my interest in education and what happens to humans in a fear-based culture, a culture of fear. So that was kind of the topic of my work, education and the culture of fear dynamic. What does that feel like, look like? And I wanted to write a play, fiction, nonfiction combination, but also scholarly work, constantly supported by references in the literature across many fields, but mainly a lot in education too. But what I didn't realize is I do 50 pages of an interview here. It's a fictional interview with Daniel Cohn-Bendit, a French resistance in 1968. The French, as they resisted, the education system fell, collapsed, the student revolts, 1968. It was a major movement against the mainstream in education, higher education. Started in France. And Cohn-Bendit was the leader, one of the major leaders of that movement. I took him and I studied, read a bit about his background, got to know him so I could write a narrative of his voice in my time, in the year 2003, as me, a Canadian. And I took him with the philosopher that I want to introduce very briefly today, is Ken Wilber, and has influenced me from 1982 forward. So I was 20 years later still trying to integrate a Ken Wilber approach to understanding philosophy and really a brief history of everything, which is one of the books he's written. I tried to have him in conversation, you can see through me, with Daniel Cohn-Bendit, the leader of that resistance movement. And then I wrote the screenplay and I had to find some characters. And my main characters, two of them, are a long screenplay on the resistance movement of the IRA. Yeah, there's no reason that I would have, I don't have that history. I have more Germanic, Russian background, Belgian background. But because I was looking for the resistance movement, I found, that IRA seemed like a really good signifier to carry on and circulate my fictional characters. And they interacted with the characters of the Matrix movie from the Wachowskis. So that's who's in my play. So you can see there's a mess of characters and mixing. So much fun and so artistic and creative, but at the same time, constantly a creak. So when I heard that John Coleman at the Apocatastasis Institute, his educational philosophy, is based in both Evan Illich, who I really respected a lot, and when I was in my 70s and into the early 80s of my reading of education and just resistance and liberation. And then P.H. Pearce. And I went, oh my gosh, the IRA, there's John Coleman. I've been attracted back in a circle to this Irish Republic kind of John Coleman-ish resistance to the way he crafts and understands the history of education and the way he crafts this new education, which he says has to be an education that integrates the individual. And that's where Ivan Illich shines, as John says, as a philosopher and thinker of our time. And then that's where P.H. Pearce shines, is for the communal. And then I won't give all of John's talk away, but I highly recommend you listen to the way he's attempting to integrate those two thinkers particularly. And he has many more others. But that's the two he goes to, and he goes to the Irish. He goes to the IRA leader, in the sense of the founder of the Irish Republic resistance movement, this resurgence movement. And that's how I sort of see John as a leader of education, so I'm just delighted to be working with John in that way. I wanted to add, as I end the video, that as John talks about education and educationists being able to find a way, and I use that language, you say, in and out of the fear matrix, that I believe we have to be fearless leaders. And that's the title of my dissertation, 2003. I did not know I would meet someone like a John Coleman and become part of his alternative institute. But he does it in a very particular way because he's critiquing and reflecting on constantly the alternative education movement, which I think is just fabulous and very rare, extremely rare. I have attempted in many times in my career, again, almost 50 years in education on the inside outside, mostly the outside, as a marginal critic, and tried my own projects, my own institutes. I've tried various kinds of alternative education, higher post-secondary education experiments. Never been able to work in an educational institution until only in the last year, when I found a very radical, somewhat radical institute that wanted me to teach one of its courses with my life partner right now, Barbara Bickle. But I just want to say that as educationists, resistance is so important, and yet we also have to have vision. And that's what I think John brings, and he brings in a vision that shows that alternative education has gone down a really not so good road, another type of enslavement in itself in the marketing of education and the whole educational philosophy. And he critiques it in more details than I will do in this video, because I'll just be repeating him, which I will not. But here's my addition as I end the video. Okay, John, you set up this very much a great understanding, or at least an initial understanding of Ivan Illich and the importance of that work for your educational philosophy. And I think it's great that the Institute, Apocatastasis Institute, has some of that. And then the communal from Pearce and this understanding of the resurrection movement, resurrection and resurgence that's required to bring a healthier communal understanding, and then bring those two together. So I call it a I perspective and a we perspective. So here's my languaging. And what I think we also need is an it perspective. I think John probably has that. We would have to talk and have further dialogues, and as well as with the other faculty. But I bring a it perspective into that. So I create a triangular, I, the we, and the it perspective. And that I get from Ken Wilber's work, which is a summary of many, many, many thinkers, East and West, over time. Wilber is a great synthesizing philosopher, integral philosopher. And so the integral perspective, which I come from as an educationist, as a resistor, is basically looking at integrating the I, the we, and the it perspective. The it perspective being a third person perspective. We got first person, second person, third person type of perspective there in a way. And that's all great because that brings a holistic model / integral model to our understanding of reality and the way that we're going to produce, in a sense, create, co-create, and emerge a new humanity at an integral level of perspective. We want individuals to be able to think in at least those three major perspectives, the I, the we, and the it. Well, what would be an it perspective? An example? Well, it could be very small. It could be the it of we want a perspective that comes from life itself. See, that's not just an I, it's not just a we. That's an it. It comes from life itself. And if you want to stretch that, you could go to divine, God, cosmos, spirit. And that's just the beginning. So those are kind of a first layer of an integral perspective. It's what's called the big three by Ken Wilber. And he relies on, as I say, many, many theorists. He builds that argument very carefully over many years. He's been philosophizing for almost 40 years as well. So I'm a student of that work. I'm also a critic of that work. I don't agree with everything Ken Wilber puts together either. He's not an educator in the trained professional way that John or I are, but he is definitely an educator of another kind and an important philosophical voice for a philosophy of education. So I would add that as I'm beginning my foray into the Apocatastasis Institute. I look forward to conversations with students and faculty and John himself. Thank you, and this is my response.